But this is sort of the canonical OpenSRF architecture diagram. It basically talks about a transport subsystem, which in all cases today is XMPP. So that's the Java protocol. There are variations. Actually, that's no longer true. The variation is the OpenSRF over HTTP variation, which is an Apache module that sits and talks to HTTP requests in return to OpenSRF back and forth. Our transport client sits on the other side of the Jabber, the XMPP or Jabber router. It accepts requests, says, okay, what service are you requesting, which eventually works its way down to an application module that implements that service. What method of that service are you requesting? Reads in the arguments, sends it back to the client, which then goes back to the transport client, which is usually a Jabber client. Goes back to XMPP or XMPP over HTTP, and then goes back to the client, which could just be a JavaScript call. So that's a really long way of saying it's right now it's JSON over XMPP by and large. XMPP is the protocol that's used for things like Gtalk, so a very large-scale Google instant messaging platform. It was designed as a standardized XML implementation of instant messaging. It's also being used under something called Google Wave. Some of you might have heard of that. So one of the things that XMPP gives us is the ability to mesh together all kinds of servers in the background to, in effect, scale out, cluster servers together to provide scalability. Google Wave and instant messaging systems are just one example of that. One of the other canonical diagrams that people point to a lot is how an Evergreen system looks. So Evergreen, by definition, is a library system that is built on top of OpenSRF. So it's an OpenSRF application. It's really the only OpenSRF application aside from some toy examples in the base OpenSRF code at the moment. But OpenSRF is out there and available to be built something other than a library system if people are interested. I think it's one of the things that's been lacking is documentation. OpenSRF was really developed in about 2005, 2006, which is a pretty forward-thinking architecture for that time, given that JSON over XMPP has been just recently become interesting. The idea is that you'll have your big web cloud out here, which will hit probably a router of some kind. You have your clusters of servers. This will probably have Apache, the Jabber router that talks to the Jabber server. All of these little beasties are their application servers, so these can be physical boxes attached to it that are running any number of OpenSRF applications. In the example that I'm part of, the Conifer library system, we really have about 4 or 5 servers. So this is for a really huge scale, like something like the Georgia Pines library system, which has 200 libraries connecting to it. They had, I think, 40 different servers attached in clusters like this. These things are called rigs. And then you have connections from the servers down to the database, which you can have database pooling, and you can have master-slave replicas, so you can spread out your read-only queries if you want. Databases that are used with Evergreen or Postgres only. Although there's a little bit of SQLite that's used for some persistent data at times, largely in the visual stack line. So JSON is JavaScript object notation. The idea is that it's in some ways it's a subset, well, it's actually a massive subset, and a standardized subset of JavaScript for providing notation for things like arrays and objects and strings. So I think in JavaScript proper, it's acceptable to have keys that are just bare strings. They don't have quote marks around them. In JSON, that's illegal. You've got quotes around them to denote the strings specifically. It's a very small specification. Fits on like a single web page or something along those lines. And it was created specifically to address the verbal load of XML. I love XML, but when you're sending a huge amount of messages back and forth over the network, pressing things down to something that's a little bit spare works a little bit better. So that's what the JSON part is. And then most recently, in OpenSRF 1.0, I believe the multi-domain aspect was added. So up until OpenSRF 1.0, essentially all of the, well, you had a router and OpenSRF client. These are both XMPP clients talking to the XMPP server. This is a really bad diagram that shows how in OpenSRF 1.0 there was a distinction. There are public domains and private domains. Until OpenSRF 1.0, there wasn't much of a need for having a separate public and private domain because authentication to those was protected by the firewall. So unless you're behind the firewall, you couldn't talk to any of these services. And there's an HTTP gateway, which is sort of the deprecated mode of accessing XMPP services, or sorry, the OpenSRF services. But in the configuration of OpenSRF, you would say, here are the public services you can talk to. So something like the database access service would not be exposed on the public gateway, so people out in the great World Wide Web wouldn't have access to it, so they couldn't call any one of the methods and unauthenticated just issue a delete all records in this database. Because that would be sort of a bad thing that had to happen. However, with the advent of the OpenSRF translator, there was a need, because that exposed all of the services, I think by the translator, we had to create this idea of domains, which meant effectively when you're installing a new OpenSRF instance, you have to create 4 users and have 2 separate domains listed. It makes your configuration a little bit more complex, but it's for security reasons. So